Hello there. Welcome to Faith, Culture, Politics in Australia with Mark. Remember to like and subscribe and follow if you can. Today, I'm going to be kicking off. I'm going to be between now and March, the state election here in South Australia. I'm going to be focusing on some conversations and interviews and discussions, and I'm going to be calling it Battleground South Australia because there's a lot to discuss between now and March. And today's guest I'm going to be bringing on very shortly, but I'll just give everybody a quick rundown on who Gigi Foster is, who I'm bringing on today. So I'm just going to go through this with you really quickly just to explain who Gigi is. Is a professor at the University of New South Wales School of Economics, a senior scholar at Brownstone Institute, a BA in Ethics, Politics and Economics, and a PhD in Economics. Professor Foster works in diverse fields, including education, social influence, time use, lab experiments, behavioural economics, and Australian policy, while also publishing in both specialised and cross-disciplinary outlets such as Quantitative Economics, Journal of Economic Behaviour and Organisation, Journal of Population Economics, Journal of Economic Psychology and Human Relations. She was also named 2019 Young Economist of the Year by the Economic Society of Australia. Professor Foster has filled numerous roles of service to the profession and engages heavily on economic matters with the Australian community as one of Australia's leading economics communicators in media and at live events. Her innovative teaching featuring strategic innovation and integration with research was awarded a 2017 Australian Awards for University Teaching, AAUT, citation for outstanding contributions to student learning. She has also co-founded the think tank Australians for Science and Freedom, and you can find that at scienceandfreedom.org in 2023, and is actively involved in the new higher education experiment Academia Liberamentus at liberamentus.org. She's an author most recently of The Great COVID Panic for the Brownstone Institute 2021 with Paul Fritters and Michael Baker, and Do Lockdowns and Border Closure Serve the Greater Good by Connor Court 2022 with Sam Jeeve Savlock. She's appeared on mainstream programs such as ABC Q&A and Channel 7 Spotlight, as well as various podcasts such as John Anderson Media, Commanding the Narrative with Stephen Tripp and Club Grubbery with Graham Hood and John Larder, to name a few. And just out of interest for South Australians, who I'll be talking to in this forum, Professor Foster also has an Adelaide connection, having lived in Martin, Adelaide for 6 years from 2003 through 2009, together with a husband and 2 young children at that time. During this time, she worked at UniSA School of Commerce. So welcome, Gigi. It's a pleasure to have you on. You've obviously appeared in lots of places, and I'm actually humbled to have you on board to have a discussion with me in regards to lots of things happening in the world, and in particular our country, and obviously in our state leading up to the South Australian state election. And I wanted to unpack a few things in that regard with you and get your insights. So clearly, as I've just indicated, you have a big academic background. You have quite a bit of an insight and a broad overview of lots of things. So welcome.
Thank you so much for having me on, Mark, and please don't be humbled. It's always a great pleasure to talk to people in the community who are doing good work. And I thought that was a very extensive introduction, and I thought at some point perhaps you would veer into territory that even I didn't know about myself. But well done with all of that. Our family was on the cover of the Adelaide Advertiser in November 2003, if anybody wants to look, because we just bought a house at that point in Martin. And so you can see our whole family there, feeling very happy to have snagged a house. Unfortunately, that house has now been razed, and the lot which we had, which was about 700 square meters, subdivided and units put up. And I know this because I was just recently back in Adelaide and was able to, have a look at what had happened. So yeah, some changes there. I was there for Kevin Donnelly's Classical Liberal Education Conference, which maybe some of your listeners will know about, being resident as they are in Adelaide, probably in South Australia more generally, at least disproportionately. It was a great pleasure to be at that conference and to be visiting Adelaide again.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, and it's a pretty common thing these days where, blocks of land in Adelaide all around the country are kind of, snapped up, and then developers are subdividing them and up they go. And a bit of feedback from a few people in regards to, whether that's a good thing, because obviously our infrastructure isn't geared up for lots of, multi high-rise units and apartments and that. So there's more of that going into smaller areas. So very interesting. Yeah. So no, pleasure. Great to have you on board.
Thank you. Thanks for being here.
I wanted to quickly kick off because I kind of got made aware of this a little while when I was obviously doing watching a few of your videos, because I have watched that obviously on Club Grubbery and that. But one of the things I wanted to bring up is that it was in regards to start off was in regards to one of your TED talks, and I'm just going to share that if I can. And bring that up. Just this TED talk, and Marion Damasi actually wrote an article about that as well, and how you were censored on that. And now I did end up locating it through that article on Rumble. So if people do want to see that, but I was going to ask you, obviously your insights into that. But I watched it, and I encourage my viewers to get back and watch it. It's only about 17 minutes, so it's not a massively lengthy one. And so many people are time poor. But if people have got 17 minutes, I encourage watching that. And one of the things I picked up on in that was, you mentioned in your talk there that for people, a message to the people you had at the time was to be alert to those in power who would manipulate you by exploiting your loves. I found that, and if people watch this, they'll kind of get that. And obviously promoting diversity of thought is another big thing. So talk us a little bit about, it's very surprising that it was actually allowed on Rumble, because when I read Marion Damasi's thing, I got the idea that they might have put some legal injunctions in place to prevent it being shown on any platform, or was it really just theirs? Talk us through that.
Yeah, well, a bit of gray area there, really. So essentially, I was asked to give this TEDx talk by the local UNSW TEDx production team, which is made up mainly of UNSW students who had seen me in classrooms and I guess liked my lecturing style and some of my references to different work, and they probably just wanted to hear more. And so they approached me and said, "Would you like to give a TEDx talk?" And of course, I immediately said yes. And I think within a couple of days, I had decided what I wanted to do, and I sent them a draft of the Manipulator's Playbook, which is the title of the talk. And we went back and forth a few times, and there's a whole rehearsal process. I mean, it's just like being back in the theater again. I did a lot of theater and performing arts generally when I was younger in high school and college, and it very much felt like that again. You had the dress rehearsal and the tech rehearsal and the blocking and the learning the lines. You have to memorize the whole thing, of course. And they seemed very happy with it, and they seemed increasingly, as we perfected the blocking and the staging and the PowerPoints that would go along with it, they seemed increasingly impacted by the message. And essentially in the talk, as you say, I talk about manipulation. I talk about how people are manipulated by those in power, and I draw a parallel between the COVID era and the manipulation of people that happened during that era, and two other eras in history where manipulation by the common man, or of the common man by people in power, happened. One of them was the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution. So basically in China, right after the Great Leap Forward, and the Cultural Revolution came on, and the Chinese authorities were telling people essentially to get rid of anything old and embrace everything new. And people would therefore go around, having been told this was good for China and good for the proletariat revolution in China, which was, of course, something they loved. They loved their country. They would go around and destroy temples and assault old people and, have various negative derogatory things to say about anybody in a capitalist industry, even a shop owner, because that was associated with an old idea of capitalism. So they really, particularly assaulting the old people, was really an affront against the deep traditional Chinese morals. Yet they did this because they were led to by this story that this is how you would help the Chinese nation. And of course, the other historical example that I use was the rise of the Third Reich in Germany, where the people of Germany who had been so, flattened economically and spiritually by what had happened in the First World War, they were really suffering, and they were looking for a way to help their fatherland. Again, patriotism is a very common thing to draw on by those in power. And so they were led to believe that essentially, in the end, dehumanizing other people was the way to protect their fatherland. And so they did this, and we know what happened. The Second World War happened, and Germany ended up in great defeat and humiliation. And China, after the Cultural Revolution, also ended in more destruction and, an abandonment of that general tack. So I drew the analogy there, and I tried to draw lessons for people in Australia and elsewhere in countries wherever they can see the talk, to try to get them to understand that this is what's done. This is a very common pattern of manipulation, to try to explain how the manipulation happens, how you can feel that you're being a good person while going along with activities that are actually destructive. And of course, facing that reality is very difficult for people. And anyway, so the local TEDx team seemed happy with this message. They seemed to think that that was a reasonable thing to talk about. And I was promoting diversity of thought because that holds the power, as I think I said in my talk, to reveal false promises for what they are. If you can speak out against what this manipulative messaging is, then you have a chance of stopping it and calling it out as a false narrative. But of course, in each of those regimes, the COVID regime, the Cultural Revolution, and the rise of Nazi Germany, there was suppression of dissent. And that's a major feature of this manipulation pattern. After I gave the talk, the local people were very happy with it, and they wanted to send it to the central TEDx headquarters in the US, I think. And I told them, look, I don't think this is going to get up, but I'm happy to try. And so we tried. And the TEDx headquarters got back to us and said that I had violated the content guidelines, the TEDx content guidelines, which of course were available online, and we had looked at them and been very careful not to violate those guidelines. And so I came up with a whole bunch of reasons why not. And even before sending the talk to them, I think I had been cognizant that I was going to have to defend various statements that I make in the talk. And so I had already sent a whole bunch of references and citations to back up the various claims that I made. And then, further corresponded with them and said, I haven't actually violated the guidelines, but they basically stopped communicating with me and never put the talk up on their website. And I thought, well, what a pity. And I was not allowed to distribute it, but somehow or other, a friend of mine got hold of it and put it on Rumble. And this friend is Jeffrey Tucker at Brownstone Institute. And because it was on Rumble, Marianne Damasi was able to link to it and write up the talk about it, or the little piece about it that she did, which I think subsequently got published as well on Brownstone Institute's blog site. And I think by now the number of viewers of that talk has approached, if not exceeded, the average number of viewers of an approved of TEDx talk. So not too bad of a result.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to remind people again, that's on the Brownstone Institute Rumble page there, Manipulators Playbook there by Gigi Foster, if people want to check that out, and can definitely put links in there as well. And obviously that Marianne Damasi article as well. So yeah, very, very, very interesting. And this is that whole cancel culture kind of thing, isn't it? Like anybody that spoke out, and you've been very critical, obviously you've put books about it, about the whole, response to COVID in general, all the mechanisms of it, and we obviously there's the vaccine side of things, but also the compulsory masks, the actual lockdowns and all that. So there's so much more involved and so much more to be critical about, I guess. In the intro there, I did show that obviously you'd done that talk with John Anderson Media and Jay Bhattacharya, and were you pleased? Obviously you would have spent a fair bit of time with Jay. Are you pleased to see that he's ended up being the NIH director now under Donald Trump? Are you pleased for him with that?
Oh, of course, yes. I mean, a huge step up from the previous leadership. I do think that everybody in that administration, including Jay, has a massive Titanic to try to turn around. And I've written about this as well on Brownstone. So those listeners who would like to check out my author page on Brownstone will see there's a whole ream of blogs that I have written, mostly with my Great COVID Panic team. So the Great COVID Panic in the background here. So Paul Freiders and Michael Baker and we've done a series of blogs, essentially fleshing out and enhancing and further developing our ideas about how to rebuild the West after the darkness of the COVID era. In different areas, so including health and education and whatnot. And I think one of the titles of one of our blogs is something like the new Gordian knots, and that's of course an historical analogy to the Gordian knot of antiquity, Central Asia, I think, where essentially there's just such an incredible amount of interdependent sclerotic problem, right, in various ways that is impeding human progress and impeding healthy societal function in various ways, that figuring out how to attack that problem and actually start even is very hard. You almost have to do the whole thing at once, or just say, look, I'm going to put this piece of rope aside, start with a new rope, right? Somebody did, in fact, supposedly solve the Gordian knot, and that, led to all sorts of accolades. But we see the problems in the United States at the moment, and many other countries in the West, including Australia, as being akin to a Gordian knot. You have many different interdependent interests which are quite far now from promotion of the common good, promotion of what is actually good for the populations of those countries. In some cases, they are coordinating with other similarly minded people in other countries or overseas through the machinations of international organizations such as the WHO, but not always even that. It's also just local incentives and people who are essentially putting their own careers ahead of their duty, their moral duty to safeguard the livelihoods and the happiness and health and wealth and progress of the societies whose populations have put them in charge of various things, whether it's in charge politically or in charge of the bureaucracy. So now it's very normal to find a bureaucratic process which is essentially on net holding back the efficient and appropriate working of whatever the department's supposed area of oversight is. So whether it's health or education or infrastructure or immigration or trade or whatever else, on net, the impact of these bureaucracies, in my estimation, in many cases, is actually negative. So that's a major problem, right? Because it means that there's a big difference between, like I like to say, the label on the box and what you find inside the box. Label on the box says, Department of Health. You look inside the box, and we wrote an article on Brownstone about this. I think it was called, Is There a Cure for the Western Public Health Catastrophe? Right? You look inside the box, you don't find health promotion a lot of the time. You find a few things that are useful sometimes. Maybe 10% of the activities of the United States health system are actually promoting health and wellness and longevity, number of lives, length of lives, quality of lives, which is, kind of the best shorthand I have for what I'm trying to go for as in a policy advisory capacity. But 90% is exploitation, over-medication, jetrivor, so essentially just exploiting people towards the end of their lives, and prescribing all sorts of stuff that is making people more ill, keeping them iller than they should be in our amazing technologically enriched age, and ignoring a lot of things that could keep them healthier. So there's a kind of keep them just sick enough to require our services aspect to the whole health system. And the bureaucracy is going right along with that. So it's not just the private companies, it's also the bureaucracy. So you have this knotted aspect. How do you disentangle this when so many players in the system are compromised in some way? They are part of the knot. So someone like Jay, or someone like RFK Jr. or Trump himself, or many of the other people in the administration or have been appointed by the administration, face this massive uphill battle. And I think that's why we've seen that there have been these very major compromises on things that a lot of us were hoping there'd be more progress on. Because, I mean, for example, with the getting a booster, COVID booster on stage and congratulating Albert Bourla, at the White House, this sort of stuff, very disappointing to a lot of us. I mean, I just called with a bunch of, I think, 30 other experts around the world in an event last week. I just called for a moratorium on mRNA COVID vaccines, right? Because I just think on net they're damaging human health. And we've written something up in Brownstone about that as well. It's called Into the Abyss, How Bad Can the COVID Vaccine Story Get? And I think that's just patently obvious to anybody who actually looks at the data that these things should be suspended until we know for sure, beyond a reasonable doubt, that they are not causing net damage to human health. Because on our estimates, they could be causing more damage than any other man-made catastrophe in the history of the world, including the Great Leap Forward, including all wars. So it could be pretty bad. That's a maximum, right? But it's possible. And if it's even possible, right, then looking at the data, looking at the uptick in excess deaths and the downturn in fertility, we're talking about tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions, of people whose lives either won't happen or will be cut short. That's just not acceptable for a supposedly medical product. And I don't care how protective it is against COVID. I care about the holistic picture. As you say, the holistic picture is what matters, right? On net. For mortality and morbidity, I care about too. And we only looked at mortality. So the effects are actually much worse, potentially. But that sort of holistic perspective, you really need to bring that. And this kind of just common sense, holistic thinking, rather than hyper-specialist, compromised, corrupted in a particular narrow area, which is unfortunately the mindset of many, many, many actors now in the state machinery and in politics. And yeah, that's why I do a lot of what I do, because I am very concerned about this. And I think the only way out for Australia is for the people in whom power ultimately resides to get wise to this, to recognize it, to recognize that they are being manipulated. And most of politics is just a dog and pony show. Their welfare is no longer being upheld. Their democratic voice mechanisms have been significantly eroded through apathy, but in other ways as well. And we have got to take back our own voice and our own stewardship of the country and insist that those in charge are our stewards, not the reverse.
Yeah, absolutely right. And a lot of people have, because of the attacks over the last 5 years, and I've woken up to the way the world runs in a real hurry over the last 5 years. I was just getting on with life. But you mentioned about the people's own interests. A lot of people are heavily invested in the outcomes for themselves. And I only just finished watching the new documentary by Del Bigtree in regards to the outcomes. There's a study that was not published on purpose by a person, and the study author, he's got him on film basically saying, I can't publish it because I'll risk my career. So this self-censorship's happening. He's saying, well, they're going to come after me, right? And this is from the Ford Clinic, right? He's an expert at the Ford Clinic, and so the study is there. But they're not publishing it because it proves it. Well, it indicates to a point, but they've hammered it because there's some technicalities around whether the study could be, used effectively. But the problem is that the person in the interview, he says, if I wasn't going to potentially lose my job and my livelihood, I would publish it as it is because I actually back it and believe in it. And this is a terrible state of affairs to be in, and because we did the same. I mean, those of us that spoke out through COVID because something intrinsically wasn't right for me, and I don't know where I got my courage for to push back. I lost my job, had a lot of heat from the family. There was a lot going on in my life at the time, as with other people, and people paid the ultimate sacrifice. But there's so many people not talking out because they're self-censored, and there's this massive power. And then you have the media and even our own politicians, even my own state premier here, because I wanted to get back a little bit about, you mentioned the nationalism and patriotism, but when a country over the last 5 years gets to a point where lots of citizens go, we actually have lost our voice. So they go, well, we're going to go out on the street because that's the only way we can do it. We can't enact violence, and we won't, and I don't advocate for violence in any way, shape or form. But our option is to get out on the street. But then you have our own premier here in South Australia, Peter Malinauskas, labeling us again as far right, conspiracy theorists or cookers or whatever they label on you, to stop people. And this is coming from our leaders, against a bigger portion of the population now that are actually saying, well, no, we've had enough. We're not being governed in the way we thought we should be governed. So if I bring that back now to, you mentioned about some of the atrocities brought about by nationalism, like this, let's just follow what the government's saying. Do you see a disconnect between the patriotism, like being shown on the streets now about, wanting to preserve the Australian flag, Australian culture, pushing back on government overreach and all that? Do you see that as a different paradigm than the whole nationalism that led to the atrocities that you mentioned before?
Yeah, very interesting question. And first of all, I'll just say I know the study that you're talking about, the Ford study, basically showing that unvaccinated children are healthier across the board than vaccinated children. If you look at Amish communities in the United States, which basically don't vaccinate their children, you do see incredible health in those children, right? And but of course, this is very no-go zone in a lot of media. For reasons to do with the profitability of vaccination, basically, right? And also people, I've vaccinated my children. I like you, I didn't think it was anything, to be worried about. I thought, okay, I'll trust the experts, right? Trust the medical experts at least. And unfortunately, it turned out that was, I'm not even sure if I'm hopefully going to be a grandmother in the next year or two. Because my daughter's getting married in April, and we've been seriously thinking, what vaccines are we going to give the children? I think probably some of them are good, but I don't have that kind of blanket trust that I used to in the whole schedule, right? Probably rubella. But I have to do my own research, right? Like, I'm not a medical professional. I have to find somebody I really trust to actually tell me, and I don't really trust the people on either extreme. I want to just what is best in expectation for this child's life, right? That's what you want. You don't want something driven by profits. You don't want something driven by conformity. You don't want something driven by fear. You want it driven by what in expectation is the set of interventions that is most likely to be good for this child's health and well-being and longevity, right? That's all you want for your child, right? Of course. And that's not far right-wing conspiracy theorist, Looney Tunes, tinfoil hat wearing stuff. That's just normal, parental desire, right? So your question about patriotism and nationalism, a really good one. I think one of the major conflicts that we've seen throughout human history is the one between competition and control. And I say this at various different levels. So you can have competition between different ideas in a meeting, council, or in a parliament, or in a family, where people can voice different opinions, and they have to kind of, argue it out, and everybody listens. And at the end of the day, maybe somebody wins that argument for that day, or maybe there's kind of a compromise, and they, each side's moved together and, a little bit to kind of get a little closer to agreement on something, but they still have their areas of disagreement. And eventually you have to continue to move forward together. But, you have had the competition of ideas. Or as an alternative model, you can have the control model. Control model is one way or the highway. And that model gets enforced through various types of mechanisms. It can be through social shaming. It can be through directly fear of being canceled. We've talked about that. Through kind of social exclusion and all sorts of other things. And that's typically one thing that really matters to people a lot. And I realized very, very acutely how much that matters to people during the COVID era, because it determined people's actions so heavily. People really did not want to be rejected by their groups for, not wearing a mask, or not keeping the social distance, or not respecting the lockdown, or not taking the vaccine, or whatever it was, right? And there were huge social consequences and economic consequences of not doing that. So that's the control-based way. So competition or control. Now, at the national or international level, there is also that choice. We can choose to set up a kind of global system, or allow to develop a global system where you have different countries competing in terms of their economic, wherewithal, and their cultural contributions and everything else, competing for bodies, basically, right? Who is running the best society where most people want to go? and are we going to, and basically the use of resources gets determined by who is successful in that competition. And of course, you might expect ebbs and flows over time as different countries are more successful or less successful, and they have natural disasters, or different leaders take charge who have different ideas or whatnot. Or you can have a model where everybody in the world is essentially corralled into one way of doing things by a central authority, whether that's the United Nations, the WHO, or whatever else. And you can imagine that kind of control spanning everything about our lives, or spanning just a small amount, like health policy, let's say, right? Or information policy, or whatever it is. Now, in my view as an economist, having studied those two systems at the level of the nation over, hundreds of years. I mean, I did my thesis in university on Gorbachev's perestroika. So I know a little bit about the Russian system, the Soviet system, and having studied as well the other, big systems in the history of man that have been based primarily on control or competition. I can tell you right now, competition wins hands down if you're looking at the scoreboard of human welfare. If that's the scoreboard that matters to you, you want the competition way, not the control way. And the basic intuition is that nobody, not the person in control and not anybody else, single person, is ever going to know the exact best way to even, or even the rough best way to organize things in an entire area or an entire society, right? So much better to put the decisions about whether it's education, health, economic stuff, whatever, into the hands of the people at the coal face, the people facing the local situation, which calls for a response, whether that's in education, health, or whatever else. That dissemination down to the ground level, which then enables competition, because different people facing different situations are going to respond differently. It's the genesis of the federalist model that you see in the US, you see here in Australia, where you've got multiple states. They can each experiment, do their own thing. The federal government doesn't really take a stand on some things, right? And then we just see which one seems to work best. And then you see the human migration follow to the places that work best. That's why you saw so many people moving from New York and California after the COVID era and during the COVID era down to Texas and Florida. And it's why today you see all the people of the world wanting to get into the developed free West. There are only maybe 5 countries in the world left that are communist. And I tell you what, the proportion of people in those countries who are immigrants is tiny, right? Whereas the proportion of people in the West, inclusive and open West, who are immigrants is much larger. And that's where people want to go, because it provides a better foundation for human flourishing. So going back to your question of patriotism versus nationalism. Nationalism on steroids, in the case of, for example, the Franco regime, can cause destruction, right? The Franco regime in Spain. Now, it's interesting to look at the Franco regime as a case in point, because it was very right-wing, of course, and it probably caused a few thousand deaths, right? I mean, you can argue easily for that. But it also was focused on economic progress. And so it wasn't actually taking control of the machinery of human flourishing, which is the economy, into the hands of the state. It was still leaving that and trying to, generate industrial production and other types of economic activity. And you had the Spanish miracle happen in the Franco regime, in the era of Franco. So while you did have some direct repression and, the nationalism kind of, you might have thought was part of that, perhaps, we must all do this. And there was a bit of suppression of people who, didn't think the same way. There was still more economic liberalism, which enabled some growth and some lifting of standards. If you look at the countries in history that have experimented with the top-down centralized control of the means of production, so communism, so we're talking about the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, China to an extent, although of course more recently they've tried to liberalize, Cuba, North Korea, Vietnam and Laos as well are communist. That's where the biggest human, life tolls have been paid. Nazi Germany, socialism, National Socialism, right? It's again socializing the means of production, and so that's the key thing. It's not the nationalism, necessarily leads to destruction. It's more the control, the centralized control of the economic machinery of the country, right? The whole means of producing gains in human welfare. That needs to be liberalized, and on top of that, having some patriotism, as long as it doesn't go so far as to become hatred towards those who are not in the country, right? That and be, basically invite people to be violent against others, right? That can be a problem. But if it's patriotism based on being proud of and defending and wanting one's own country to do well, I see that as a very positive thing, and certainly positive if you compare it to the alternative, which is everybody under one world empire and cheering for the UN, because that is the control-based plan, which in my estimation, based on my studies of human psychology and human groups over time and history, is the recipe for destruction of human welfare.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you for that. And this is I guess the concern because obviously I've never been politically motivated, and the last 5 years has obviously changed that. And as people watching my show know that I'm putting my hat in the ring to run as an independent next year in the state election here in South Australia. So it's a big task, I get it, and one of the reasons I want to kind of bring this information like yourself and others forward. But one of my, like I see you mentioned socialism and communism there as well. We seem to have a government now that's got a lot of control in all the states plus federally, and Labor appears to have that socialist communist sort of Marxist tilt. I'm not going to go out and say that they're all socialists or communists, right? But they have that tilt in their policies, right? So it's really, and I have a big concern since I've become sort of more politically and aligned and doing a bit of research, is I actually believe less government is better in the whole. So I have huge concerns and pushback against, I guess, the Labor at the state level and also the federal level trying to manipulate more power, assert more power over its people. And then if you add to that the groups you mentioned, these international groups that looked at that centralized control, you've got the UN, the World Health Organization, all that, even the WEF and all that. But even on a monetary level, you're looking at the Bank of International Settlement, you're looking at the International Monetary Fund. So they all have this control, almost this one world control of, we want you to live this way. Is that, like, do you see that as a bigger concern going forward in our country? The more that the average Australian goes, we want to put our faith and trust and everything in government, as opposed to that individual thought. Like, I mean, it seems like it's a dangerous place to go for us as a country, right?
Absolutely. It's very dangerous, and it's particularly dangerous for Australia because we already have such high levels of apathy and political ignorance, even, I would say. I mean, historical ignorance too. In my class today that I just taught right before coming on, I asked the kids, if you ever heard of the Great Leap Forward. I put up the world data on human deaths, deaths year to year from 1950 to the current day. And you look at the graph and it goes along, reasonably regularly. And then there's a big spike, and then it goes along and there's another spike. This latter one is the COVID era. That was our policies, right? That was all the stupid stuff that we did that killed people. And it was also some COVID deaths, but mainly it was our policy reaction. But then the previous one, it was in 1958 to 1962, and I asked the students, what do you think that was? I got all sorts of suggestions. Vietnam War, no, that was too early for that. A virus, nope, that wasn't that. What was it? It was the Great Leap Forward. That was the Chinese mistake. That happened under communism, right? That's what it was. It was a centralized control saying, okay, this is what's going to happen. You're going to be in charge of this production, and you are going to go over there to be in charge of that. We're going to take these people off of the machinery or the farms that they know how to run, and put somebody else there instead. Or we're going to change where the factories are away from what people decided there was the best location. They're going to put it someplace else that the central government decides. That's just bad. It's going to be inefficient. And I'm not an ideologue by any means, but what I care about is human welfare. And when I see that kind of inefficiency creeping in, I know that that's going to, particularly in a country like China, which is not exactly super wealthy at the time, in the 50s, right? You don't have a lot to play with. You don't have a lot of slack. If you make major mistakes, you're going to starve people. And that is exactly what happened. Those inefficiencies that were introduced through that planning system were enough to kill millions of people, enough to have it show on a global death chart, right? So it's really nothing to sneeze at. And we have this problem of looking to government, as you say, in Australia, thinking that they're the ones who are going to solve our problems. And that simply opens us up to being exploited by people who simply want more power, right? Power is an aphrodisiac. I tell my students, power is a hard drug. That is the way to think about power. If you are talking to somebody who has a lot of power, think of yourself as talking to a heroin addict, and anything that he or she hears that he or she thinks may threaten the supply of heroin is going to be defended against, suppressed, denigrated, called fringe or unmainstream or somehow canceled, whatever. It's going to be seen as a massive threat to their supply of heroin, to their supply of power. So that's the mental framing to bring, right? So the reason why we don't want that centralized control is because it centralizes too much power. It's bad for the country in terms of the ability for anybody in the center, even if they didn't have a lot of power and weren't corrupted. It's difficult for them, it's impossible for them to know exactly what factory should be where and how many workers should be hired and who should be in charge and all that sort of stuff. It's impossible. But on top of that, you have the problem of power being so hideously corrupting to the human soul. So there's two huge reasons to push for more dissemination and more personal responsibility, because when you take your own agency for your life, you are doing a public service because you're grabbing some of the control that otherwise will be usurped by somebody else who is higher at some high level of authority and is going to probably abuse it, given the levels of power that we see today. Yeah,
great. And you've given me a great segue there into obviously talking a little bit more specific into South Australia. But before I do line that up in regards to that power, that global power, you've been involved obviously with of the Aligned Council of Australia, and they've done a lot of work in regards to the international health regulations, the WHO pandemic agreement, and that. So this is again, a big, talking into this whole power structure of global power structure. But and there was lots of concerns. People raised lots of concerns in regards to the pandemic treaty, but others dismissed it, saying, people are just, overthinking this. Sovereignty still stays with Australia. We still have control over things. But and they said, look, it's up to the individual states or the federal government to make sure that they that what they put in, that it's really only guidance, is how they frame it. The WHO is only given guidance. But if we have a look, I guess through the COVID era, the WHO actually had. We've got collaboration centres all around Australia, right? And I shared this the other day. South Australia has the Collaboration Centre for Point of Care Testing. They had that. They also had Centre on Advancing Health in All Policies Implementation. and also one for Collaboration Centre for Mass Gatherings and Global Health Security. And obviously that one's now obviously no longer current. It expired in April 2025. But when I was mentioning it in another podcast, it was really because now the state government actually doesn't have to worry about that because I shared this as well. This is the updated emergency management declaration that here in South Australia has been put forward. Now, lots of people have raised concerns about this, and some of the main concerns raised, and this is not just Sarah Game's the only one that pushed back, but other institutions like the Law Society even raised concerns, and other commentators about the overreach in this bill. So we're talking broad extension of general powers, introduction of a state of alert declaration, ministerial powers to override other laws, lack of oversight and safeguards, and impact on vulnerable groups and volunteers. And obviously, they say, it's really only just, it's there, it's nothing really to worry about. They're talking about, ultimately validity depends on perspective, valid for those prioritising rights and past harms, but overstated for those that focus on effective crisis management. So, we already, here in South Australia at least, now have these powers that seem to give the state government a heck of a lot more powers, and that frightens someone like me because I've, COVID really woke me up to a lot of stuff, right? So I'm, and this is one of the reasons why. And it was so counterintuitive for me to get into politics, because there's obviously you're going to cop a lot of flack. I'm going to cop a lot of flack. My family's going to cop a lot of flack. I'm talking against the narrative of what's going out there. So no one really wants to put themselves forward for that. But I really see this as a massive risk for my fellow South Australians and my children, my grandchildren, by giving the state this much power when you tie it into the international health regulations and you tie it into the pandemic treaties and so forth. Do you sympathise with my concerns in that regard there, did you?
Yeah, no, very much. There's so many things to say about this. First, I'll say that Australians for Science and Freedom also made a submission to the Senate inquiry into the IHR amendments, the International Health Regulation amendments that the WHO proposed, and we were asked to give testimony to Parliament. So I will be traveling down to Canberra next week to do that. So we have an opportunity to speak for 5 minutes, and so I will put many of the arguments that I've put in the submission, or we've put in the submission, and that I'll talk about today directly to the Commonwealth government. So we'll see whether that moves the dial at all. I don't have high hopes, but one has to take the opportunity, as you have done by entering politics. So good on you for that. Yes. So the first thing to think about when you are confronted with a proposal like this, I mean, at least if you're me, first thing I think about is, would this proposal actually help people? Would it actually advance health? Right? What are we getting that is actually demonstrably connected to more health for South Australians, in your case, than we currently have, or than we would have without these things? So when I ask myself, well, what does the WHO system of control or suggested, mechanisms or strongly encouraged mechanisms of testing, tracking, tracing, and all the other stuff, what does that package of intervention, plus everything else that's in the pandemic treaties and the IHR, what does it add to the health of Australians? Or what do these emergency power extensions that you just talked about in the SA legislation, what do they add to the welfare of South Australians? If I ask myself that, I do not get an intuitively positive answer. My answer, I don't think there is a justification for these things that goes more than skin deep. I think that what happens is exactly what has happened so many times in history, and I talk about it in The Manipulator's Playbook. People are sold on these ideas that get dreamed up by those in power who want more power, and then packaged, dressed up, wrapped in flags that look like concern, altruism, caring, protection, security. They look like all these things that naturally we all, of course, want for ourselves and our children. And we are just lulled into believing that the only way to get that security and love and protection and everything else and high health is to go along with these harebrained proposals, frankly. And people just stop thinking about the actual connection between the proposal and the thing that they wrap it in. Right? And actually, when you think about that, where does health come from? Is Australia so incompetent that it cannot do its own testing of pathological, samples, pathogen samples? Are we really that backward that we can't communicate to our local councils when maybe there's some, rise in the incidence of flu or something. I mean, we're getting bombarded with information about health constantly through just the headlines, right? And we have an incredibly sophisticated system of communication. We've got a world-class health system. We've got lots of hospitals and doctors and all sorts of people, right? Why do we need the WHO as well? What can they possibly do that is going to enhance our health beyond what we could actually advance ourselves? And by the way, even at the level of the country, why do we think that somebody in Canberra is more likely to know what's best for our health than somebody else in our own family or our local GP or our local community nurse? Right? Locally is where most health is produced. We locally decide whether we're going to exercise, how much we're going to exercise, what we're going to do, what we're going to eat, how much we're going to sleep. Are we going to drink good water? Are we going to have adequate social relations and, good sort of healthy interactions and relationships in general with people? Are we going to have meaningful work? Are we, supported in various different attempts to get healthier? Do we have access to good quality, nutritious food that is reasonably cheap, right? These are the main things that support health, actually, right? And a lot of that stuff doesn't even come under the health banner anymore, right? That's like, public sewage or something, right? Sewage is a health investment, right? I mean, that is the main thing that raised living longevity back in the mid-1800s. People finally discovered, thanks to the work of the sanitarians, like Charles MacLean and his compatriots, that actually what was killing people early, including children between the ages of 0 and 5, but also older people, was being really unclean and not having enough good quality food. Those are the main things. So dirty water, no sewage, inadequate food, and not very nutritious food options. When those things started to improve, when there was a Public Health Act of the UK that was passed, and they basically just started putting in sewage, systems in cities. And I don't mean like fanatical cleanliness, but just lower the viral and bacterial load sufficiently that the body can deal with it and survive, right? That's what you want. That's what you do with the sanitation mechanisms. They did that, and you commensurately see human longevity going right up, starting in about 1850, right? In the Western European countries. And that continued and went even beyond that in the early 1900s when milk became widely available. Milk has vitamin A that's highly protective against things like measles, right? That was the main thing that made measles deaths plummet to be basically not a big issue. Although, of course, if you talk to the vaccination companies, it was still a big issue. And, the further decrease was a huge, victory. Really, it was kind of off the, not even part of what people were worried about anymore after, the mid 1900s, because it had sort of been conquered, right, by these fundamental health investments. That's where health comes from. So when we are deluded into thinking, well, we have to be part of some international system to protect our health, we've just become unmoored in our sense making about the health production function. Health is produced locally. That's it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned food in there as well, and we had some people writing up in regards to that new legislation here in South Australia that it also can, gives them the powers to go into people's properties, rip out gardens, kill animals, all these sorts of things that people are concerned about, because we've got a bigger movement now that is doing exactly what you're sort of hinting at, is that more that communal level. People are coming together and going, well, how can we work together as a community? How can we have communal gardens? How can we, you might have sheep, I might have chickens, you might have this vegetable, I have that. And this is where people have been pushed towards, and it's kind of where more of my thinking, rather than that centralized control, even at state and federal level, is bringing it back to the council level and that community level, where people find solutions and problems for themselves based on their community, rather than the bigger issue there. And you did focus obviously on, you just mentioned in regards to health, and I intend to look at reaching out to Professor Ian Brighthope, because I really wanted to speak to him in regards to health outcomes, because that's a big one for me in South Australia as well, because we've got massive ramping still, we've got massive hospital attendance, we don't seem to have enough, and we just constantly seem to hear our health bureaucrats talking about sickness. But what we're not having enough conversations about, and I think you mentioned that earlier on, is this conversations around how can we live better, how can we become healthier, so we're not having to rely on our hospital system, so we're not having to impact ramping. And people like Professor Brighthope, obviously with the Wellness Centre and all that, has a lot to say about that. And I think we need to have more of those discussions, rather than constantly vaccinate here, take this medicine here. How about we just live better? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I know Ian well, and we are very, our thoughts are quite aligned on the basic pillars of health. Certainly nutrition is a big thing for him, and also the community basis of most, high quality, actually useful health interventions, right? GPs, local nurses, midwives, etc. The people who just, fix up the cuts and bruises and do the occasional baby, bringing into the world, and give people lifestyle advice on how to, get healthier. And you don't hear, the people in the health system saying, hey, why don't you run a marathon? Or, have you been, what's your nutritional quality before they put you on a medicine? A lot of the time, there's just a kind of an absence of nutritional understanding, often an absence of statistical knowledge as well. Education in statistics is woeful for doctors, which I see as a major problem, because it means they don't have perspective on what's actually important and what just looks like it's important because it's in the headlines. So we have a lot of problems about that. And I think your approach of empowering communities to provide the services that the governments are failing to provide adequately is exactly the correct approach. And indeed, in those communities is where you can germinate new ideas for alternative systems, right? That's what Australians for Science and Freedom is all about. That's exactly what we are aiming to do, is be a place where people can dream about new systems, draw up blueprints for how else could we run education? How else could we run health? How else could we run media? How else could we design our democratic voice to be actually heard and more impactful than it is today? And then when the country is ready, or when some other country is ready, or when a region is ready, or when, somebody has had enough, and so have his compatriots, the blueprint is ready to go and it can be trialed. That is the way that change happens. It does not generally happen when things get this far gone in the governing mechanisms, being so far removed in what they're actually achieving from what their mission is or is stated to be. Things do not get better by those in power having a light bulb moment and realizing, oh yes, I'm sorry, we really should do things quite differently, and I should step down and I should give away all this power back to the people. That's not how it happens. We know that. Again, any student of history knows this. What happens is that an alternative is found, and that's what draws, as we say in the biz of economics, market share. Right? People recognize that works better. I'm going to go there. And it happens with footsteps, and it happens with now media, online media, coverage, Joe Rogan, whatever he talks about, that's like, oh, I wonder if that would be better. Right? So people can now actually think about alternatives much more easily than they used to be able to, certainly before the rise of all these independent media channels, which is great. That's a great development. How else can we encourage diversity of thought and experimentation and alternative system design, and doing it at the community level where you can ensure each other on all sorts of different, areas, whether it's health or food production or education or whatever else, is great. I mean, education is a great example. Homeschooling. What if you have a collection of, 10 or 15 families, and the kids just rotate from family to family, half a day at each one over the course of a fortnight. And, each mother or father at the place can teach whatever they know, right? Or whatever they are best at teaching. I mean, that would be awesome. Why not do that, right? What a great idea. I think if I were having a kid today, I'd be like, that sounds good. And you're getting the socialization component, and you're creating a community through those kids knowing each other. And what's not to like? That's how humans kind of, for a very, very long time, tens of thousands of years, kind of lived in those sorts of, hunter-gatherer tribes of 20 to 50 people. So it kind of matches better what the living situation that we knew for a very, very long time before the advent of agriculture. So it's just probably better for us psychologically than our current system of living with a massive central authority which has way too much power, and then a lot of anonymized little atomized family units, right, which just doesn't have the power and the fortitude.
Yeah, exactly. And just tying in the emergency powers thing, and just coming back to that from an economist kind of standpoint, one of the other big things here in South Australia that I'm actually pushing back quite vehemently, because I think it's going to be just, the destruction of our state and our energy security, is our state's declaration of a climate emergency here in South Australia, which was done in 2022. So, you as an economist, you're obviously across the cost of rollout for renewables and all these other sorts of things. But for me, it also worries me, because these emergency powers, whenever they declare some sort of emergency, they could use climate change, man-made climate change, as a vehicle to enact more restrictions over our life. So how do you see that tying into kind of some of the concerns here in South Australia, when our state government's got these emergency powers, they've got the climate emergency declared, they're hell-bent on, they've blown up our coal-fired power plants, plant and go and hell-bent for renewables. Are you concerned for South Australians based on like how the South Australian government's pushing ahead with these agendas?
Yeah, no, most definitely. Whenever a government intervenes in a way that private sector didn't already do, that's creating those inefficiencies I talked about before. My biggest question would be, why didn't private industry discover this? If this is such a great thing, why didn't private industry discover it, first of all? Now, if the answer is, oh, because private industry would not care to protect the climate, right? Then you have to ask, well, are you really protecting the climate more with the actions that you're proposing relative to what we're currently doing? And there's a whole Pandora's box of stuff to talk about, right? First of all, if you really believe that coal-fired power plants and airplanes and all the other ways and farting cows and whatever else are all making the earth warm to the extent that the most extreme people even think that it is, right? And I don't want to say, whether that's right or wrong, but even if you believe that that's correct, the amount that Australia or South Australia is contributing to that is tiny. So what exactly are we getting? What would we get in terms of fewer natural disasters, fewer bushfires, lower temperature, whatever? What would we get from this move to all the renewable technologies of creating energy, so-called renewable, versus the coal-fired plants that we've been using for generations to generate our power? What are we getting? And even on that basis, I don't see how the argument can stand. And then you have on top of that the argument that there may be a lot of other reasons why we have been perhaps experiencing more or thinking we are experiencing more bushfires and perhaps having a slight rise in the temperature, more variation in temperature. There's lots of other reasons for that. And if you look throughout history, not just human history, but the history of the earth, as much as we can construct it, it looks like before humans came along, there was a lot more variation. And even throughout human history, there's a lot more variation than we have been experiencing just in the last 100 years. So we have a very, very, very narrow perspective on what's normal for the earth. So even though there may be some effect of humans, it's probably not as big as the most extreme estimates of that effect would have you believe. And even if it is, then the amount by which we could actually change anything with these massive changes to our industrial pillars is inevitably tiny, infinitesimal, and the cost is large. We know that. We know that the cost of these so-called renewable energy transitions is very large. That's why the subsidies are required, because private industry haven't discovered it. They don't think it's economical to replace the grid with solar and wind. It's just not. And even if we did want to move away from fossil fuels in the longer run, a lot of the people who talk about these climate emergency issues, so-called, want to not talk about nuclear energy at all. When nuclear energy is, not producing fossil fuels and has been used successfully in many countries around the world, again, for decades. Look at France. Why don't we bring some French engineers over here and tell us where we should put a nuclear plant? If you're really so concerned about the climate, that would be an obvious thing. So the way that I see this is, on balance, most likely to be yet another manipulation attempt. People's love for planet Earth, for Mother Earth, which of course we all have that love is taken out of your chest, twisted, hijacked, and then hooked on to this thing called a climate emergency. And then if you don't subscribe to it, by implication, you hate Mother Earth. So that's just another of the same exact pattern of manipulation that I talk about in my TEDx talk.
Yeah, exactly right. And I mean, as a scientist, you've got a PhD. Does it concern you when you have people like Undersecretary for Health, Melissa Fleming, saying that they own the science in regards to climate change, and they've partnered with Google and their algorithms to prevent people accessing information about that? Does that concern you at all when you have people like that going on?
I mean, so yeah, in science, we can have probably a whole nother discussion about this, but in science, freedom of thought, freedom of speech is a primary pillar. You cannot have science without freedom of speech. You cannot have it. You won't have science. You'll have dogma. That is what you'll have, right? And so what you just saw is an attempt to replace science with dogma. That's it.
Yep. Yeah, exactly right. Now, you've been really generous with your time, and I see we're sort of cracking into the hour, and I know that you're very busy, you've got a lot on, and I'm really grateful for the time you've spent. And hopefully, over the months, we might be able to catch up again if you're willing. I just wonder if, for the South Australian community, if you had a message for them about, when they get to March, coming up the elections, obviously what's going on, would you have some thoughts about what you'd recommend for them to look for in their kind of like their politicians or, the candidates and stuff like that?
Well, I mean, certainly as a voter myself, what I look for are policies that I think are convincingly, rationally tied to increases in human welfare in my electorate. That's what I want. And so I am very unmoved by grandiose virtue signaling, hand wavy statements. I want to know what's actually going to be done. So somebody who is prepared to defend his or her policies on the basis of increases in the welfare of South Australians. That is the thing that the electorate should be pushing for, because that's what they deserve. That is what should be prioritized by anybody in power. So I would say do not be fooled or be satisfied with hand wavy statements about, yes, we care about Australia. Okay, well, do you really? What are you going to do? So get serious about actually interrogating the policy platforms and missions of the people who are running for office, because I think you will discover very quickly that many of those emperors have no clothes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Well said. And this one might be a little bit trickier. Is look, all accounts and purposes, the polls are indicating obviously that Labor's still pretty strong with the people, and Peter Malinauskas is more than likely going to end up having the numbers in March. What would you say to Peter Malinauskas and the Labor government leading up to March? Then, what would you recommend to him going forward?
Please call me. Please call me so we can have a long, hard chat. And so that I can try to reach into your heart and rescue what is left in there of moral courage and duty, to a sense of duty to the Australians you serve.
Yeah, no, great, well done. Thank you very much. And we did cover quite a bit of ground, and there's so much more that we could be talking to. But obviously, we're both busy. We've both got lots of things going on, and we've covered a lot. So I really do appreciate your insights, and I'm pretty sure the South Australian viewers would be very grateful for what you've been able to contribute. So thank you so much. And I do watch Graham a lot, and I'm not as good as him at praying, so I generally don't finish my segment with praying because I don't have the words. I usually end up finishing. I've been listening to Christian Blues, and I've got a YouTube channel that I follow, and I usually play an outro on that. So I again thank you very much, Gigi, and I really look forward to hopefully catching up again one day. Thanks so much for your time.
Of course, it's my pleasure, Mark. Thanks for having me on. I look forward to talking later. Bye.
Awesome. Good on you, Gigi. Thank you.
Stepped in the garden, the moon hung low. Leaves held their breath as the pain began to grow. He told his friends, stay close and pray. But sleep came heavy and drifted them away. He fell to the ground, his voice like rain. Let this cup pass if there's another way. But deeper still, the vow rang true. Not my will, but yours to do. And the garden shook with every tear. The weight of the world drew heaven near. He bore the dark that none could see, so light could reach you and me. The silence roared as the sweat turned red. The angels watched while the prayers were said. 3 times he cried, 3 times alone, while the ones he loved slept like stone. He stood and faced what love must mean. A kiss would come and change and be. But still he walked, no turning back. The Lamb had chosen the narrow track. And the garden shook with every tear. The weight of the world drew heaven near. He bore the dark that none could see, so light could reach you and me. The ground still holds the memory deep of the night the Savior chose not to sleep.